The referee floodware is back in session. Parties and counsel are present. All members of our jury and alternates are present. The witnesses back on the witness stand. And Mr. Doherty, you may comment.
Thank you, Your Honor. Sir, you talked on, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
You talked on direct examination about your pro bono work in Georgia. Right?
Yes.
And the award that you received from that.
Well, actually, I think the pro bono work was in Indiana for that award in Georgia.
Okay, so you did pro bono work in Indiana, and you got an award in Georgia for that work.
Correct. It was from a national foundation.
Now, it's pro bono means free, right?
Correct.
You're not testifying here today for free, are you?
No, cybernetics is being paid.
How much is cybernetics being paid?
I think they're being paid, for my time, it's $800 an hour.
How about for this pool?
Cybernetics charges $350 an hour for her time.
And how much was it, how much have you billed so far in this case?
I think the first report on like 7 evidence items and all the match comparisons was about $50,000. Our usual reports are about $5,000, but there was a lot more information in this case.
Let's talk a little bit about that information. The request comes in, and the data comes in to your office, right?
Correct.
And that came into Ms. Pujols in this case?
Yes, I can check. There probably would have been an interaction with Stephanie, who does the intake work first, and then the data would have been directed to Beatrice.
So Stephanie does the intake work, Beatrice gets the data, and then she inputs the data into the True Little software.
Yes.
And she did that in this case, right?
Yes, she did.
And she's the one that set the parameters that we talked about earlier when she was testifying, right?
Yeah. Yes, based on the protocols and the data.
Right. And then she conducts the runs of the data based on those protocols, right?
Correct.
And then she compiles the data in a report, correct?
Yes, she does. There's some intermediate steps of reviewing the results, discussing it with her supervisor, doing additional runs, but that's basically correct.
Okay. And all of that work, discussing with her supervisor, and everything else was done by Ms. Pujols in this case.
Yes, I was involved, probably speaking with the supervisor, Bill Allen, about getting it done.
That wasn't my question. My question was, she did all the work in this case, right?
I can check. She did certainly most of it.
Check.
Yes, Beatrice did all the processing in this case.
Okay. And she's the one that compiled all the reports, and her name's on all the reports, except for one day, January 10th of this year, I believe you signed off on it and reviewed the results. Is that right?
Beatrice drafted the report on January 10th. Jennifer Horniak, another analyst in our office, verified it. The process supervisor, William Allen, reviewed it and gave a final report, clearance, and then I did the administrative review.
You've had the True Little software right around 20 years, is that fair to say? In various forms?
Well, not in anything that we could use. And it was in 1999 that we first started separating out mixtures from the data. The system went through 10 years of evolution with a number of collaborators, 25 versions as the statistical modeling kept expanding, and it was first used in a criminal case in a court of law in 2009. We had used it for the World Trade Center disaster in 2005, which is a large database comparison project of the victim remains and the missing people, but its first use in a criminal case was in 2009.
Okay. Something about my question, it asked you about its first use in a criminal case.
Objection, argumentative.
I can't hear you very well, by the way.
I'm sorry. Did anything about my question ask you when the first time it was used in a criminal case was?
Sort of, yes. The question was, when was it ready to be used in court? So you can have early prototypes of a system that's doing pretty well, but the system isn't perfected and it's not ready to use, and we wouldn't have used it in that way until then.
Okay. So when did you start selling it?
When we started selling it would have been, there may have been some early groups, I don't know, 2008, 2009, as it was getting ready.
So about 10 years then, you've been trying to sell the product.
No, 10 years ago we were selling the product.
So prior to those 10 years ago, you were trying to sell the product before that?
No, we didn't have. What actually happened is we were working closely with the British government, and the contract that we had with them funded the R&D on other projects, like the mixture separation.
But at least since 2009, you've been trying to market Truly, right?
We sell systems to labs, and we also sell consulting services to prosecutors and other lawyers.
Okay, you've been doing that since 2009, right?
Correct.
And since in the last 10 years, you've been selling the product, 10 labs have purchased Truly or regularly used Truly.
Correct.
How many labs are there in the United States?
About 250 non-federal labs.
And how many federal labs?
I think about another 100.
Approximately 350 labs, and your product's used in approximately 10 of them.
That's correct.
And backing up to where we were before, Ms. Pools did the work in this case, and Ms. Pools is here today, right?
Yes, she is.
And she testified earlier.
She did.
At what point did you learn that this was going to be on camera?
I think over lunch, when they were photographing my eating.
You didn't see the cameras here this morning?
I don't know why there are cameras here.
So you first learned that this is a high-profile case over lunch today.
I didn't even know it's a high-profile case. I heard someone's doing a documentary.
Have you been interviewed by the defense's documentary in this case?
No, we just had lunch.
Did you make plans to be interviewed by the defense's documentary in this case?
Objection as to the form of the question, Your Honor.
Sustained.
Did you make plans to be interviewed for a documentary in this case?
No.
So, you've been trying to sell the product for about 10 years. You're regularly used by 10 labs. And you were asked questions on direct about your source code. You recall that line of questioning?
Yes, I do.
And you wrote that source code. That is a computer code that runs through it. Right?
Yes, about 170,000 lines of computer code.
That was going to be my next question. About 170,000 lines.
Well, I didn't write all. The user interface code was written by other programmers.
And that's proprietary.
It is.
And as part of your marketing efforts, you actually put videos on YouTube, don't you?
Again, I can't hear. You provide what on YouTube?
You provide videos. You put videos up on YouTube to market.
Yes, we have legal education, science education, conference talks. We have a Truly YouTube channel.
And one of those videos is about common complaints about Truly, or common challenges to Truly, right?
I don't know. There's over 100 of them.
And one of them, didn't you say that asking you to give up your source code is like asking you to give up the beating heart of your firstborn child?
We're on better terms now. Probably sounds like something I'd say.
there have been demands for your source code, right? Across several states.
In the past, there were no legal challenges that were won. There was an appellate ruling that went our way, so I guess there was a trial court. But about 2 years ago, we decided it wasn't worth the hassle, and if somebody wanted to come to Pittsburgh under confidentiality and take a look, again, we don't know why anybody would want to do that, but it was just easier to stop arguing.
So there was a fight about releasing your source code, right?
It was a fight that we repeatedly won, but it was a lot of work.
And the reason people wanted to see your source code, your understanding, was they wanted to see if there's any errors in the code.
Objection, causes speculation, and hearsay.
Validation studies. You talked about validation studies, and you indicated there's been about 35 of them.
Yes.
And 7 of them were in journals, published in journals.
Correct. There's a requirement from the FBI's quality assurance standards that with any new DNA technology, whether it's a robot or a chemistry or a computer program, that there be a developmental validation, usually conducted by the manufacturer, often together with a crime laboratory, and that it be published in a peer-reviewed journal. So we had our first one in 2009, but then we had more to say, so we published a few more.
You said we. All of those 7, you're either an author or a co-author on.
On 6 of them, I'm an author or a co-author on. Usually the co-authors are crime labs. On the 7th, I think that was done by the Virginia Department of Forensic Sciences.
Establishing the limits of true allele. Sounds right? That sounds like their study.
Yes, that sounds like their study.
And when you do a published study like that, and you're the co-author, you have to disclose conflicts of interest.
Yes.
And in those studies, those 6 that you wrote, or co-authored, you had to disclose that you were the chief financial officer, or chief executive officer of cybergenetics.
Actually, almost nobody discloses their conflicts of interest, but as an Eagle Scout, I really feel obligated, and I always disclose that I've worked with somebody, I own a program, there's a company, something. So I have very complete disclosures.
Sure, and that's because you could have a financial interest in the results, and you want everybody to know that.
No, I just do it. I don't actually think that. I just do it because it asks, do you have a potential financial conflict? And I can't look at it and say, well, no, I could. So I fill out everything I can.
Is it true that True Allele has never rejected data that you can get?
I don't understand the question.
Well, has cybergenetics ever rejected data that you've been given? In other words, you look at it and go, there's nothing here. We can't do this.
We do reject data. If data are completely flatline and there's nothing informative, then there's no information there, we wouldn't report on it. Our usual process doesn't involve accepting or rejecting data. At cybergenetics, we receive samples from a prosecutor, defender, innocence group, police, whomever. We process it at no cost and then provide an initial preliminary report so who's ever receiving it knows what they're getting into. It might completely disagree with their idea of what they want to find. It could implicate somebody they want to exonerate or vice versa. When a group reviews that report and then they want to continue, then at that point we'll advise them on how little they need to get done for their case. I lost an argument with a district attorney it's a very bizarre argument. I'm arguing he needs 2 items, he wants 6. But, because they pay based on the information, but they usually don't need that much information. So our model is initial free screening, followed by preparing a report based on the amount of information someone requests.
Well, if you get flatline data and you run it through True Allele, you get results.
What we would get is, so True Allele is a Bayesian system. So if the initial genotype is the random population, and we run uninformative data through the system, it's flatline, or essentially it's just background noise, then the output that we get is, again, the population, because there was no change. Bayesian reasoning involves changing probability based on evidence. If the evidence is uninformative, we just get back out what came in, and the ratios then are all 1, and there's no information. So that wouldn't be anything anyone would use.
In other words, when you put information, data into TrueAllele, and it's not informative, you're basically going to get a result that looks a lot like the FBI population database.
Correct, filled in with all possible genotypes. The FBI has frequency data on some alleles, but not all alleles.
And in this case, you received data from Bodie, right?
Correct.
And you ran the data at 5 RFUs. We heard quite a bit about RFUs.
Correct, that's what Beatrice did.
And Beatrice, well, are you aware that Bodie sets their analytical threshold at 125 RFUs?
Many labs don't look at a bunch of the data, that's true.
My question was, are you aware that Bodie set their analytical threshold at 125 RFUs?
No, we don't really look at or care about what people set as thresholds because we don't have them.
Okay. And we've heard at least 3 DNA experts now testify that thresholds are set based on the lab's instrumentation and the particular kits that they're using in their DNA analysis.
That's partially correct. It's also based, and primarily based, on their interpretation method. So the purpose of generating data is to be able to interpret it. The thresholds don't come in when the data are generated. They enter when a person or a computer is trying to interpret it. If you're using methods that are by eye or don't make as much statistical use of the data, then the older threshold method from 20 years ago and the updated one from 10 years ago will involve rules by which you discard some of the evidence. The newer technologies, including TrueAllele, that have more statistical modeling don't need to discard that amount of data.
The purpose of the statistical threshold is so that the individual reviewer can be confident that they're actually in real calculation.
Your Honor, objection, is that a question or testimony?
Well, the last one wasn't.
The objection is overruled.
And I didn't finish my question first.
Oh, the objection's overruled. I see. In the human review method, that's true. A person needs to set a threshold because they can't do the calculations a computer can do to dispense with one. So they have a different concept of what's reliable to the human eye and the human mind than what a 100-dimensional computer analysis would be that can account for all the data peaks and not just the ones that are at a very high level.
Well, their calculations are based on what they know about that particular instrument. True?
In part, they're also based on how they interpret their evidence. They have an instrument that same electronic data can be viewed by their laboratory, by people using thresholds. That same electronic data can be viewed by TrueAllele, essentially not using thresholds at all. It can also be used by other probabilistic genotyping software, like what's used in this county, where it's sort of in between. So it's based on how rich the modeling is and how much can be automatically done by a computer. If there are people without a computer, they will not use as much data.
Well, let's talk about that data in the computer and what the computer uses then.
Yes, 1019.
Becky, can I have this computer, please? Okay, I'm showing you exhibit 1019, the first page of that exhibit. We just saw this a minute ago. Do you see that?
Yes, it's the same exhibit.
And these are what we've been referring to as called alleles. In other words, does the data support these alleles being in the sample?
This is a reduction of a genotype with probability for the purpose of database search. We wouldn't use it for anything involving interpreting evidence.
So my question was, does the data that you received support the alleles that are represented here on this table?
The data in combination with the model, yes, the computer model.
Okay. In particular, I want to ask about location D2S1338. You see that here?
Just say it again. Slower.
D2S1338.
Yes, I have that.
And at that location, it's your testimony that the true allele system called 16, 17, 19, 20, 23, and 25.
No, it's my testimony that TrueAllele produced a genotype with probability, and for the purpose of database searching, that at a 90 or 95% probability level, this is a list of alleles that would be suitable for database searching.
Do those alleles at that location exist in the data?
They may or they may not. For example, if you had totally uninformative data, you would end up with the same alleles you started with. The question is, what is the probability distribution over allele pairs? From Bayes' theorem, it's a combination of the prevalence of alleles together with how well they explain the data.
Okay, so those alleles may not be at that location in the data that you received from voting. Is that your testimony?
In a Bayesian genotype, that's correct.
Okay. So, in fact, in a Bayesian genotype, the absence or presence of a peak doesn't matter at all. Right?
That's false. If you have more alleles and you have taller peaks, then you have more support for the alleles that are seen in the data. It is true that if there's no data at all, a probability system will still produce a genotype, but it'll be based on how common those genotypes or alleles are, not based on the data that is uninformative. It's a combination of the two.
Okay. I'm going to put up, I don't have an exhibit number yet. I apologize. It's kind of a graphical model of the Bayesian system for the type of system that TrueAllele uses.
Yes, this is from James Curran's paper from 2008, which I cite.
And doesn't Mr. Curran say, under 1, the true genotype is independent of any of the factors under consideration in this model. The presence or absence of a peak in the EPG does not imply or exclude the true genotype from having that allele.
That's true.
Okay. So the presence or absence of a peak in the electropherogram doesn't mean it is or isn't there.
That's correct. For example, in the amplification process, a common phenomenon on data that many labs report out on, who don't even use TrueAllele, is something called dropout. The process of generating the data and amplifying it may miss an allele or not amplify it in sufficient quantity. Just because you don't see data alleles in data doesn't mean that the person didn't leave a genotype. They just may not be present in what you can see.
So in what you can see, if it's not there, you can infer a genotype, depending on other factors.
Well, if there's nothing there, you still have to infer a genotype. It just doesn't change the probability. The end result of probabilistic genotyping is a probability assigned to every possible outcome. Alleles in the data and their patterns will increase the probability of those allele pairs, those genotypes that that are present or supported in the data, and reduce the and if they're absent, will reduce the probability of others. But if it's a probability distribution, you have to give some probability to every possible outcome.
Okay, so if there's nothing there, you still assign probability to it.
Yes, if there's not. In fact, if you don't even run the program and you give it no input, you can. I guess you could do that. You would end up with the same genotype you started with, which is the population.
So I'm going to continue down. This is on item 3, E03. And again at D2S1338. I'm going to show you exhibit 1010. Is this a color copy of the electropharogram that cybergenetics received? Do you know?
We receive data from the crime labs so we can make sure we have the right data.
Okay, so my question was, do you know if this is the data that you received from the crime lab?
I can check it in my notes. If it has the same item, well, I can check it if you'd like. Yes, that looks like the data for that item at that locus from the picture that we received from the crime lab.
Okay. And at that location, after running through True Allele reported 6 alleles at that location.
No, the reduction from what True Allele did report for the purpose of FBI database searching listed 6 alleles at a 90% probability level.
And those alleles were 16, 17, 19, 20, 23, and 25.
Based on the list you showed me, yes.
And True Allele is looking at data that's way down in what we call the grass down there, right?
You can call it the grass, we just call it background noise.
I'll call it the grass.
Sure.
It's looking at data way down there, and it's looking at things like peak height is one factor, right?
Well, it's basically looking at events and peak heights. So yes.
Events, and that includes the peak height and the length, right?
Yes, the length determines what the allele is.
So the length determines what the allele is. The peak height determines. It all plays into what True Allele is going to report as statistically probable at that location. Length, height, and area.
It's not using area, it's using the length as the allele and the height as the quantity of DNA.
Do you have the length and the height? Do you have that chart available for that location on that item?
Yeah, so you don't mean the TrueAllele EPG, which is showing lots of events. Do you mean the listing?
Oh, thanks for reminding me.
Sure.
I'll do that first.
You're welcome.
Okay, showing you Exhibit 1018. It's up there on the screen.
Okay.
I'm going to find D2S1338.
Can we take about a 5-minute break?
Sure.
We'll take a 5-minute recess. We'll see everyone in the back in about 5 minutes. We're back in session. Parties and counsel are present. All members of our attorney are present. The witness staff and the witness stand. Mr. Rotary, you may continue your examination.
Thank you. So, okay, so the middle purple graph there, that represents D2S1338 on cybergenetics electrophoregraph.
Yes, the data in purple are the data from the electronic data file that comes off the laboratory's instrument. The boxes on top are labels indicating which allele we're looking at for any peaks that are at 10 RFU or higher.
So it will label peaks that are at 10 RFU or higher.
Yes, because the user on the top right of the figure that we don't see indicated that's what they chose to see. It doesn't affect the computer calculation, but when people are zooming in and out of data, they may want to see more labels or fewer labels.
Sure. So at least here we're looking at a cutoff of 10 RFUs, and make sure we have the locations right here. D2S1338 and goes along here
Yes, for display purposes.
for display purposes. Is this prior to it actually running through TrueAllele system?
No, this is afterwards for display purposes when someone's reviewing their data. There's an interface like this when someone is initially looking at their data as well. It's the data view.
Do you see on there where 20 is labeled?
No, that has a peak height that's under 10 RFU. It would have been considered by the computer if it was 5 or greater RFU. But since a person chose to not see peaks that low in their display preference, it wouldn't be seen.
Okay. It was placed onto the allele table for database uploading.
Well, there are many reasons it could be true. In this case, it's a peak.
I'm asking you if it is true. It was reported as a 20, right?
I'm answering your question.
Okay.
There are many reasons why that could be true, but in this case, it's there because the computer saw or was given input of that peak at a level of 5 RFU or higher. The display that we're looking at on this figure is not what the computer is seeing, it's what a person is choosing to see and print up after they've run the computer program.
Okay, so the computer sees a 20 And the person looking at this who set it at 10 RFUs is not seeing a 20.
Yes, and if they set it to 100 RFUs, they wouldn't see very much here at all. But the computer would have considered it.
Okay. And then similarly with 23, the computer sees it, but it doesn't show up on this electrophoregram.
Yes, that's listed on page 61 of this case packet, where the data that the computer considered is listed.
Okay. And 25 actually is visible here on this electrophoregram, and that's actually on the results table for database upload, right?
It's labeled because it's at 10 RFU or higher.
Okay. Now, the 23 allele had a length of 329.8. Does that sound right?
I could look it up. Based on the table on page 61, yes, that was the analyzed result.
So the jury sees what we're looking at here. At 23, the analyzed result was 329.8. This represents the length. This represents the peak height. That means 7. And this is the area under the curve.
Yes, which isn't used, but it's represented anyway.
And the 23 here is the reported location.
That's the allele of that peak.
The allele of that peak.
Correct.
24, you see that?
Yes, I do.
Has a length of 333.6. Is that accurate?
That's what's written here.
That's what TrueAllele is saying, right?
That's what the analyzed program is providing as input. Correct.
And a peak height of 7.
Yes.
And an area under the peak, which isn't used, as 2.
Correct.
The 23 is reported on the allele chart, and the 24 is not. Right?
Yes, based on genotype probabilities.
So you have 2 different representations of alleles with similar length, similar peak height. One's reported and one isn't.
I'm trying to think of how to explain this to you. So the data comes in as alleles. We see a pattern on electrophoregram. That data isn't a genotype. It's just data. It's a reflecting of what's in the biological sample. The computer then looks at that data, tries explaining it 100,000 different ways, follows the laws of probability, and when it's done, it produces a genotype probability distribution based on the prior prevalence of genotypes, as well as how well those patterns constructed out of combinations of genotypes explain the data. That's also listed in this case report. And then looking at those posterior probabilities, a list of alleles for database search purposes, not for statistical or reporting purposes, is produced. So an emphasis on alleles is basically wholly missing the point. The alleles come in as data with different heights. For a CODIS search for a database, it only knows about alleles. The FBI's CODIS database doesn't know about genotypes and probability, so we have to put it in that form. What is important would be the genotypes, which is the distribution of allele pairs and their probabilities, as well as the match statistics that are valid match statistics calculated from those genotypes when a comparison is made. So it's true that there are alleles in the data that are not relevant to genotypes or match statistics in this processing. It's true that there are alleles in a database format that's designed to search the CODIS database that doesn't understand about probability, but that's not what's being reported for the purpose of inferring genotypes or comparing them to calculate a match statistic.
The data is not important.
Your characterization of the alleles as being primary is it's an old way of looking at things.
Okay. And it's a way that's accepted in all but what, about 10 labs that use true allele.
They don't look at the allele approach that you do, no.
Why did you even create the chart?
Excuse me?
Why did you even create the chart, the allele chart?
For the purpose of conducting a database search, since the FBI's database doesn't use yet concepts of allele pairs and probabilities, we have to put it into a 20-year-old form that's just based on human review and thresholds. That's how the database functions. So we have to retrofit it to an old approach from the FBI's database, as anybody else would have to do, in order to even conduct a search. That search, if it returns profiles, would be the starting point for calculating accurate match statistics using genotype probabilities. But the alleles are not part of that. It's the genotypes, which are probability distributions over allele pairs, and the ratios of probabilities to calculate match statistics.
So when you reported it in a form that's 20 years old, you do report 24 allele. 24.
And there was a cough. Just say that again?
Yes. When you reported it in this older format as you characterized it,
Yes.
you didn't report the 24 allele.
Are you referring to the allele list?
Yes.
Yes, because that. I wrote down the page number for you. If you were to turn to page 297, you can actually see what TrueAllele produced as a genotype with probability. And that would be in the case packet.
But what it actually produced isn't based on this data, which includes link and p-type.
Of course, it's based on data. It's half of Bayes, how well different genotypes and their combinations explain the data.
And your testimony is that the data here, even though it's quite similar, 24 doesn't explain the data. That allele, that data doesn't have.
If you look at the actual probabilistic genotype that was produced on page 297, we can see what the computer did produce based on the data it received, its model, and the prior prevalence of alleles.
Of the 4 known samples that you were given, care to take a guess as to who's the only 24? Or I'm sorry, objectively infer who's the only 24?
I would have no idea. I wouldn't speculate.
Well, you have the known sample.
The computer compares the known reference with whatever the computer produced.
Do you get the electronic data for the known samples?
We sometimes get it in lists, and sometimes we get it as electropherograms. I can check and see which it was in this case. The reference samples were sent to us as reference tables. So it would be in text format.
So it's in text format, which looks like the allele charts that you produce in this case.
They're the genotypes of people. They have one or two alleles because people have two parents. So to the extent that a genotype is comprised of a pair of alleles, then a chart that contains alleles could be viewed as looking similar. The concept that we only have two parents and we only have two alleles, in that sense, the charts are different because there's more than one or two alleles. Moreover, the chart that we're looking at is not how genotypes or these reference files are produced.
Okay, but my question was, what you received as the known samples comes in the format of Charles Merritt 1214 at this location, 811 at this location, just using hypotheticals. That's how it comes to you.
Yes, up to two alleles at each locus, a person's genotype.
So you're using the 20-year-old method when you input the known samples, and you're comparing it to your new method when you compare.
A person's genotype, the genotype that you have in almost every cell of your DNA in your body, when you look at a particular location, will have basically imprinted on it that barcode. It will have that, say, 10 and 12 at a particular location with one allele inherited from your mother and one from your father. That's not a 20-year-old standard. It's about 2 billion years old. It just happens that in sharing information, a genotype of a person can be represented as one or two alleles at every locus after the experiments are done. It's very simple data. There's essentially no probability involved with a good reference sample, and it's conceptually not the same as long lists of alleles that are created for database search purposes from an evidence review process. There are alleles in the same way that I said before, buildings have bricks. So you're going to have bricks in the buildings, but they'll have different types of buildings. The alleles that are on the sheet for a reference have to do with what a person has in their body that was measured on a cheek swab or some other tissue. These database search lists are from a completely different process.
Okay. I put back up on the screen exhibit number 1010. This is the data that you received from Bodie, item E03 at location D12S391.
D12. Which item number again?
E03.
E03. So this is an electropherogram, which is a written form or a PDF file or printout from Bodie's viewing software of the underlying electronic data. And it's the underlying electronic data that we or another group would rely on.
This is cybergenetics. Electropherogram data. At this location, so in other words, between here to the left of D12S391 and to the right, the computer found 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 alleles.
I'm not sure what you're looking at. I don't see. anything labeled on that picture.
I think that's the point. This is from Bodie's data, and at that location, true allele called 8 alleles.
I just have to check what you're saying. Give me a second.
Senator, I would object as to that location even be relevant because we don't have that as a location identified as the known profile.
The objection on relevancy is overruled.
Okay, I think I have enough information here to try to answer your question.
Okay. Go ahead.
Could you repeat the question?
Sure. At that location, the true allele software called 8 different alleles.
TrueAllele doesn't call alleles at that location based on a user viewing preference that's higher than what the computer saw to unclutter the picture at 10 RFU. That's what you're seeing. The computer considered more data than what is labeled in the boxes here.
I'm going to show you Exhibit 1012. You see the item number here, 303.
And Your Honor, again, the same objection on this exhibit.
Overruled.
I see a picture with gray bars and data and so on. I don't know what it's from. It's not part of the TrueAllele system.
Does this case number here, under sample name, match the case number that you received information from Bodie from?
Yes, it's the same sample name.
And E03 was one of the samples that you recognized?
Correct. It's the same sample name.
Okay. Now, you see where here it says bin for 15 allele, bin for 18 allele, bin for 20 allele. What's a bin?
A bin in this type of software, which is not ours, would be a range of sizes where, based on calibration data that's done during a DNA testing run, would place a size of an allele as being in the bin or not in the bin based on whatever algorithms that were used and on the data.
And then when you get the data at cybergenetics, you actually have a different bin, or create different bins for the data?
We don't have bins in that sense. I mean, what we do, as I explained to you earlier, is that TrueAllele converts the sizing data, the pixels that are seen, using 2 two different types of calibrations that are present in forensic runs. One run together with all the tests, and one called allelic ladder, run in a different lane, but is part of the same machine. And then it provides a number like 153.7, estimating what the length is of that DNA fragment. So it uses more of the data, more of the calibration data, and a more sophisticated way to identify what are the sizes of the samples. The method that you're showing here looks like it lacks the, perhaps it lacks the allelic ladder as part of an integrated math, but I don't know. I've never seen, except for what you may have shown me, I don't know what this is.
Okay. So the short answer is, you don't know what this is.
It looks like a primitive sizing algorithm from software I don't use. So I know some of what it is, but I couldn't tell you the math behind what it's doing.
I'm going to turn your attention here back to 10. It's 1019. Back to the chart that you created. First page of that chart. It'd be fair to say that, in particular at SE33, every single allele, 1 through 18, is represented on SE13.
SE33, I mean.
I'm sorry, SE33.
SE33 was not used in our reports, and what that would indicate, though I could go and check the details, is that there was no clear winner. There was no clear concentration of probability, and so in order to reach a 90% probability level, many different low probability events had to be considered that ended up essentially being like the allelic ladder. So that is the prior probability in the population. It's if you don't have an informative result, then your probability distribution of allele pairs looks a lot like the population, and to get a lot of 90%, 95% probability, you'd have to consider many allele pairs. So I would say it looks uninformative.
And in fact, that's true on all three of those, or on two of those three tables that you created, right? At that location. And I'll go to the second page of that exhibit. Is that true for that sample as well?
It looks like it's true on two of them that it was uninformative. I could check the genotype and tell you more definitely. It's in the case pack.
And you said that that wasn't considered as part of the statistical analysis?
There was no SE33 in any of the reference samples to compare with. So we can't compare with data we don't have to form a match statistic at that location.
But at that location, you didn't have much data in the evidence file either.
That's true, but we couldn't have made a comparison even if there was infinite information.
But you didn't have much data, but you reported data.
That's correct, but actually, I can, if you'd like, I can check the genotype result and verify that it's a very dispersed probability, or I can just say that's what it looks like based on what you're showing me.
And similarly with regard to we already talked about D12S391, 15 alleles at that location and we're on the second page, so on item E05 away.
Yes, again, without looking or checking the genotype, it looks like it's dispersed probability, which brings in a lot of different allele pair events. So it's generally uninformative.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit about that dispersed probability, starting with item E3. You provide a probability chart.
Yes, it's in the case packet.
And probability chart compares basically the probabilities based on the evidence of two different alleles. And all the allele combinations, all the potential solutions at that particular location.
I think what you're trying to say is that after having seen the data for one of the separated contributors, that at each locus there's a listing of the allele pairs along with their probabilities.
Right, and all potential allele pairs, all potential solutions.
All the potential ones would be in the computer. I think we listed out to 99.9 or 99.99%, so as to not tear down entire forests when we print these things out. But it's in the software that you received if you want to review the results.
And I'm going to ask you about the results because you provided it in the report. You list the most frequent or the highest probability allele pair that's listed first under the particular location.
Yes, the allele pairs are listed in descending order for any particular locus.
Okay. So move back to the first page, 1019. So, for instance, the most probable allele pair at CSF1P0 is 1112.
For EO3,
Yes.
yes, that's shown on page 276 of the case packet.
And the probability is right around 37%.
38%, but yes.
38%. Okay. Throughout all these probabilities, there's only two locations that are over 55% as far as the most probable allele pair.
That could be true. The concept of most probable allele pair doesn't have much to do with match statistics. Match statistic is a ratio of the probability that we see that you see after the computer's looked at the data divided by before. So it's that ratio we saw before. It's not what the other probabilities are at the other events. That doesn't enter into a valid match statistic.
Okay, but you combine the top three or the top probabilities until it's right about 90% certain at a particular location.
Right. If you're going to create an allele list for database purposes, then you would begin with the most probable, but then you'd continue to the next most probable, next, and so on, and add up the probabilities until you hit 90%.
So you do use that information in that context when you're creating your allele chart.
There's no allele chart, but if we're creating an allele list for the purpose of searching a DNA database, we will.
Doesn't that look like a chart to you?
There's a technical meaning to the word allele chart that this doesn't satisfy, so
Okay.
no, it doesn't.
Allele list. Okay.
Thank you.
Go ahead. Are you finished?
I think so. I lost my train of thought with the interruption. Sorry.
You discussed earlier, just as an aside actually, SWGDAM and their probabilistic genotyping guidelines.
Yes.
And they actually recommended that this probabilistic genotyping is not meant to replace human interpretation. Right?
That may be the FBI's view.
Well, my question was, that was Swigdam's protocol, right?
No, that was a set of guidelines from Swigdam, which is an arm of the FBI. I don't know why they would say that if they had an effective statistical program.
And my question was, did they say that?
I can check a document. If they said it, they said it.
You have it?
Yes. Where is it in that document?
Guess. Can I come up to you?
I'm not going to let you touch it, but okay. Just where is it? Okay, it says from the FBI, Swigdam's group, probabilistic genotyping is a tool to assist the DNA analyst in the interpretation of forensic DNA typing results. Probabilistic genotyping is not intended to replace the human evaluation of the forensic DNA typing results or the human review of the output prior to reporting.
So it does say that. Yes?
Yes, it's not intended to replace the role of people in the process. People are still involved in the process.
People are still involved in the process, but what you're trying to do essentially is take out any critical thinking when it comes to evaluating data. Fair?
No, we're trying to put in a mathematical assessment of the data. We're trying to eliminate bias and provide objectivity, and also provide validated accuracy, which the older human review methods never had.
And accuracy would review, you mentioned earlier on direct, you're looking at whether somebody we expect to be there is there or not, right? Their DNA is there or not.
As reflected by a DNA match statistic, correct.
As reflected by, so we're looking to see if somebody you expect to be there is there, as reflected in a match statistic.
Correct.
Okay. You have a medical degree.
I do,
Are you familiar with the process of decomposition?
to some extent.
And during decomposition, essentially there's several stages of decomposition, right?
Yes.
Why did you hesitate?
I was thinking through the different stages, and some of the words are pretty gross, so I decided not to state them.
Putrefaction,
Liquefaction is pretty bad, yeah.
liquefaction, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So, the body, when it decomposes, the DNA is going to break apart and degrade.
Yes, if it's exposed to the body's enzymes or an environment that would promote that degradation, yes.
So, the body has its own enzymes that break down and chew up the cells, degrade them.
Yes, and that's complemented by the bacteria that have enzymes that come in afterwards and also chop up DNA, can chop up DNA.
And so there's also DNA in the environment potentially that could also contribute to that. The soil, things like that, have bacteria in it that can chew up DNA.
Right, by contribute, I assume you mean contribute enzymes that chop up DNA as opposed to introducing extra human DNA.
Yeah, no, I didn't mean to suggest bacteria. But they're breaking down the DNA of the process. Fair?
Yes, and if DNA is exposed to those enzymes, then that could happen.
Do you have an opinion as to what would happen to the DNA of bodies that were buried in desert conditions for 3 years, 9 months?
There might not be much measurable DNA left. In order to measure the DNA, the whole paragraph has to be intact. If there's one cut, that represents degradation, and with just one cut through the paragraph, it can't be read by the forensic DNA machinery.
And mentioned earlier on direct that a body has nearly 1 trillion cells.
There's trillions of cells, yes.
Trillions of cells. So if a body is in the ground over time, there may not be much DNA, even though there's trillions of cells worth of DNA as it decomposes.
Yes, the DNA could be cut up and reduced to the building blocks of the DNA instead of the DNA sentences that were there in the first place.
During your PowerPoint presentation, you said, I can have this computer. Right here on the first slide, you said this is E15, E1 electrical cord. That's a picture of it. You recall that testimony?
Yes.
You didn't get any pictures of it when you were asked to analyze it, right?
No, we usually don't know what things look like. We don't know who the people are most often. We don't even know what the case is about. We process evidence through the Allele computer. It separates the data into genotypes, and then we make comparisons and produce match statistics.
Okay. So when you said here's a picture of it, you've never seen a picture of it before. In fact, you were provided a picture of it.
Yes, it was provided by James McGee.
And the exclusionary statistics, well, sorry, we can draw that question. Do you know anything about the condition of the items that were tested prior to the data arriving at your lab?
Not really. I mean, we'd heard afterwards that they were in soil, they were buried, but that's more recent.
So after 3 years, 9 months, if not much DNA from a human body is present, would you expect to touch DNA?
Well, it would depend what it was exposed to. If there was, for example, if there was touch DNA inside of a sealed container that was not exposed to the elements, then you would expect the DNA would probably be there. If the DNA was on a surface that was exposed to the enzymes and the elements, then it probably wouldn't be detectable. If it was on a part of a surface that wasn't exposed, then it wouldn't be chopped up. So it would depend on not the DNA itself or whether it was touch DNA or not. It would depend on, was it exposed to all these degradation enzymes?
Okay. So if the body is exposed to those degradation enzymes and items are in close association with the body, would you expect that those enzymes would also degrade or chew up touch DNA?
I would object to the form of the question. Close proximity is bad.
It would depend on whether that DNA, touch or otherwise, was in contact with the enzymes that would be chopping up the DNA. If it was in contact, then you'd expect it to disappear. If it wasn't in contact, then you would expect that there could still be measurable DNA signals.
Let me show you exhibit.
Signals?
Exhibit 211. You've never seen this photograph before?
When I visited Riverside for a trial 2 months ago, I stopped by James McGee's office and he showed me 100 or 200 photos in quick succession. This might have been one of them, but I'd never examined them closely.
One of the items that cybergenetics analyzed was white cord. And we discussed the results of exclusionary statistics from that white cord. The white cord was wrapped around the body as it was decomposing, as you see here in this photograph in the middle. Would you expect that the individual whose body was there in the ground would have that individual's DNA would be on that cord?
Probably not if it's from a part of the cord that had been exposed to the body.
Okay, can you clarify that, please?
Yes, if the cord had been tied up and there was DNA on part of the cord that didn't come in contact with the body, whether it was from that individual or some other individual, then it wouldn't be exposed. And so there would still be, or could still be, DNA.
Wouldn't be exposed to the individual's DNA, the deceased individual's DNA?
It wouldn't be if it was exposed to the enzymes that were chopping up the DNA.
And the enzymes come from both the soil and the individual's body.
Correct. And from bacteria that are replacing where the body was.
Okay. If that cord is wrapped all the way around that body, during the liquefaction stage, wouldn't that body's DNA end up on the cord? By process of gravity, if that's a picture of the body in the ground?
It could, but so would the enzymes that chop up the DNA from the soil, the bacteria, and the body.
So there's enzymes that are going to chew up the DNA from the body and all of those things. And if the entire cord is exposed to all of those things, wouldn't you expect touch DNA to also be chewed up by those bacteria? I know chewed up's not a scientific term.
It's good enough. It would depend whether it's touch DNA or not. It wouldn't make much of a difference. The question is, would it be exposed? We know that from looking at the data, that the items that we looked at were clearly degraded DNA, which means that they were chopped up. We also know that the longer sentences from the markers that have longer paragraphs were more degraded. They were more chopped up. But we also know that there was information present. So there was some DNA, and there was DNA from more than one person. So it may not be from that body, it may not be from that individual, but the data are telling us that there's actually some detectable DNA. Otherwise, we wouldn't be getting average match statistics in the thousands or millions.
But your data excluded the deceased individual's DNA that was wrapped with that item. Right?
Correct. So
I'll show you exhibit number 378. One of the items that you showed a photograph of had a male end on the extension cord. Do you recall that photograph in your PowerPoint presentation?
which item is this?
It's going to be item E11 or 15. E11.
That's what's called white cord.
Yes, and the photograph you showed during your PowerPoint presentation had the male end of the extension cord, power cord.
Yes, that was on slide 24.
And do you see how that's wrapped? Would you agree that's intimately connected with the body?
Yes, what I don't know is from what part of the cord that the DNA that was sample that we analyzed was actually obtained.
What if I represent to you as the entire cord?
Then what was ever, if the cord had no knots, if it had no crevices, if there was nothing in it, well, we know there's DNA from there, so I would actually have a bit of a quandary as to how we saw informative DNA from somewhere sampled from a cord if there was that was highly degraded, if there was no place the DNA could have been, like tied up in a knot or inside some region.
It's weird, right?
No, it's not weird.
Is it an anomaly?
No, I don't know that I have full information about whether there was any other. If whether this was a totally smooth surface or if it was tied or untied. I don't know.
Okay.
There needn't be any anomaly if there were parts of the cord that were bound up in such a way that they were never exposed to these enzymes and they weren't cut up.
Okay, so that would be a good place to look. If you were going to look at a cord that had a knot in it, you would look at places where the DNA might be protected from the elements, from those bacteria and other things that you get at it. It would be this in the middle of the knot.
That's correct.
So that would be the good place to analyze that particular cord for DNA. But if you just took a swab, if you unknotted any knots that were in it and just took a swab of all of it, what's your opinion about that?
Well, you would get the DNA that was protected from the knot, along with nothing from the areas that weren't protected. It's kind of like when a handgun swabbed and all four surfaces, the grip and the trigger, they're all swabbed and they're put together in one tube. If one part of the gun has DNA, you'll detect it, even if the other parts don't.
And then with regard to the strap, the red strap on an E08, you're showing photographs of how that was associated with the body?
Objections, foundations, we don't know if that's E08 because there's two straps.
Sustained.
Um,
That's right, you,
That's okay. You don't need to answer. One of the items you were given was a red strap, or was identified to you as being a red strap.
yes, A25/E08 was identified as a strap as the source of the DNA.
And would your response here similarly be what it was with regard to the cord?
Your Honor, again, objection, foundation, because there's two straps collected from the body. We don't know which one this is.
sustained.
Okay, let me ask you hypothetically then. If the red strap was closely associated with the body, would your response be similar to what it was a minute ago with regard to the cord?
Yes, there would, from your description, there would be protected regions and unprotected regions, and swabbing the entire strap could collect the DNA from the protected regions, such as from a knot.
And your explanation for why on that white cord Joseph McStay's DNA isn't there is it's probably really chewed up.
Say that again.
Your opinion then with regard to why Joseph McStay's DNA is not on there, that it's chewed up.
I think, well, some of the DNA is chewed up, most likely, but what we are seeing is there's a DNA component that has information, looking at it, that's around 10,000 as an expected match statistic, and that component that we looked at doesn't have a statistic that associates with any of the 5 references.
One of the 5 references to Joseph McStay.
Okay.
Identified you as Joseph McStay. And if I tell you that the dead body that you're seeing right there is Joseph McStay's body, he's excluded, his DNA is excluded from that cord based on your analysis.
Actually, would that be McStay child number 1
No,
or number
Joseph
2?
McStay Sr.
Are you saying Joseph?
Yes.
You're too far away. I'm not hearing.
I'm sorry. I'll try to speak up.
Okay, thanks. That would indicate that this component of the mixture was not statistically associated with Joseph McStay Sr.
Can I have this one over here?
Sure.
Actually, I'll just couple. Can I have whatever computer this is? Okay, this, I'm showing one of the slides of your PowerPoint. I don't know the exhibit number. This is item E03, 1019. Hypothetically, if a full-grown adult female has decomposed in close association on top of touching this particular garment for a period of 3 years, 9 months, would you expect her DNA to be on that item?
Not in an area that would have been exposed to the decomposition process.
So she was laying on top of it, or it was on top of her, or it was in close association with her. You wouldn't expect her DNA.
In an exposed area, correct.
And that's a full-grown adult female with trillions of cells of DNA.
And even more enzymes that would be chopping up the DNA, and more bacteria that would be growing on that and chopping up more DNA.
And that same bacteria would be chopping up any touched DNA.
If it was exposed, correct.
Well, it's on the same item. So
If
that's
you-
you assume it's all on the same item.
Right, but an item can have different parts. It can have parts that are exposed to the elements and parts that are not exposed. Like a knot, for example.
Or something else that's protecting it.
Correct.
But if that whole item, if the MVAC procedure, are you familiar with that procedure?
Yes.
If the MVAC was of the entire item, front and back, you wouldn't expect that DNA would be representative of touch DNA that had been there for 3 years, 9 months.
If it was, well, whatever the DNA is there is there. If it's not in a protected region, then it's chopped up and there's not much left. So it would be representative of not seeing any signal. But then there's the part that might be more protected. If there was not, if there wasn't, that'd be a different story. Or somehow protected. And then you'd be seeing the DNA that wasn't exposed.
I represent to you that the body that was closely associated with that item in gray for 3 years, 9 months was summer McStay. It's still your opinion that she's excluded statistically as a contributor to any DNA that's on that item.
That's what we found with the software, correct?
And in fact, Charles Merritt is even more likely than Summer McStay, based on your analysis.
If by more likely you mean
Probable?
if by more likely you mean a match statistic of the exclusionary of 1 in a trillion as opposed to 1 in 100 trillion, that's technically true, but they're both highly exclusionary.
Court wants to take a step break now.
Sure.
I'm a little bit more unsure. Mr. Green may want to do that.
Sure. We'll go ahead and take our afternoon or evening recess at this time until 9:30 tomorrow morning. Keep in mind the admonitions previously given to you, not to form or express any opinions about the case, not to discuss the case, or allow anyone to discuss the case with you or in your presence. Again, that means not discussing about the case, any of the witnesses, testimony, exhibits, parties, or attorneys, and we'll see everyone back at 9:30 tomorrow morning. And I'll schedule each back tomorrow morning as well.